So I've actually wanted to make a sort of little bit of a video about the salary cap for a couple of weeks. And then as I was sort of looking around and researching it, obviously news broke about how the Premiership were reducing the salary cap. So I didn't know if this would make this video more relevant or less relevant. But I thought it was sort of interesting to make anyway. And it probably does have some, relevant information, but God knows what's happening with the salary cap at the moment, because things might get a little bit hairy, judging by how the players have reacted to it. But I think it is important to talk about the salary cap and how to manage the salary cap, because the only time we really sort of talk about the salary cap is when teams are allegedly breaking the salary cap. No one really thinks about it that much until we lay accusations at doors like teams like Saracens, who were, as it turns out, actually breaking the salary cap. But it's not just Saracens that have had those accusations laid at them. Bath have had it for years, Bristol, Gloucester, so many teams that just have these accusations labelled at them. But there's more to the salary cap than just going over or staying under. Obviously, you want to stay under, but how you do that is important. So I guess the first thing I wanted to do was go through some quite boring stuff, which is explain what the salary cap actually is. So obviously, in simple terms, you have a set limit and don't go over that limit. But there's actually a few caveats within that. So sometimes you'll see different figures for how big the salary cap actually is. Sometimes you'll see £6.4 million and sometimes you'll see £7 million. And the reason for this is there's actually sort of different blocks of the salary cap. So what there is the thing called the senior ceiling. So this is your senior players, and you're not allowed to pay them more than £6.4 million per year. But the reason the 7 million figure crops up is because you have £600,000 of homegrown credits. And this is players who joined your academy whilst being under 18 and are now a senior player under the age of 24 at the 1st of September. So there's this block of £600,000 that you can only play your homegrown players under 24. And there's a few other sort of caveats around it. We have the marquee players. So essentially, there's 2 players in your squad that you can pay as much as you like. They're actually called excluded players in the relevant sort of documentation and data. The marquee never comes up, but we always call them marquee players because that's what they are. But this is why we see guys like Stuart Hogg and Faf de Klerk in the Premiership at the moment. And there's a few other sort of things around it. There's injury credits, so if a player gets injured, you're allowed to bring in someone who is of equivalent or less experience than the player that they're replacing, and that caps at £400,000. And if there's players playing for England, you can get a few credits from that, although that doesn't add up to too much. And I think it might cap at £80,000, but I don't know if that's per player and things like that. A lot of the report, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't really understand it. There is an academy ceiling, which is £100,000, but I don't think academy players count towards that, or homegrown academy players don't count towards that. That's only for players who joined your academy after the age of 18. There are a couple of ways that you can kind of circumnavigate the cap a little bit. So just outside the excluded players, there's a few other ways where there are ways of paying players that don't count towards the cap. So one of these ways is if you send a player out on loan to a championship side or another side, they play a game, and you bring them back as injury cover, 3 of these players don't count towards the salary cap, although that is provided they play less than 4 games in the Premiership or the European Championship. So this is something that a few clubs did. It was 6 clubs, and people were trying to kick up a bit of fuss, being like, how dare teams do this? This isn't in the spirit of the salary cap. But if it's in the salary cap rules and regulations, do it. That's kind of, I was actually kind of shocked that Bath, the team I support, did do it, because I kind of think Bath maybe are a little bit stupid sometimes. So it was actually kind of, for me, I was like, oh, Bath are doing a smart thing. And actually, we shouldn't be criticising the teams that have done this. We should be criticising the teams that haven't done this because they haven't read the regulations properly. One other thing that doesn't count towards the salary cap and feels like it sort of should is transfer fees. So you can buy out someone else's contract. And this happened most recently with Bath signing Cameron Redpath from Sale, who I think they paid about £200,000 for to make him become a Bath player. Those figures don't count towards the salary cap, which is kind of surprising because it feels like it could quickly become out of control, and it hasn't yet. But I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because not only can you use it to buy players outside the salary cap, so that's something you can use if you are a rich club to actually throw your weight around monetarily without breaking the salary cap, but also definitely an opportunity for smaller clubs with strong academies. You think like Worcester and London Irish, they're teams that could definitely profit from this, and if they treat their players like assets that they can sell, then they might be able to get some financial security and eventually grow to a point where they are getting money they can spend on players to get to the top of that salary cap and be really, really competitive. Now, in the last video I made about things we can learn from other sports, I sort of talked about positional value, and obviously this is incredibly important when managing the salary cap, and that's something you want to think about. How much are you paying your fly half? How much are you paying your hooker? The best hooker in the game should not be paid the same as the best fly half, because fly halves are more important. And that's something worth thinking about when managing the salary cap. And this is where I sort of come from the crux of like wingers don't matter as much because they are just more replaceable. There's this supply and demand about it. And that's where I think a team like Exeter have been especially smart, essentially just not really paying wingers, because you can get production from your wingers who aren't necessarily superstar guys. But another thing I sort of thought about, which is kind of interesting, of how you manage the salary cap, and the only other sports really with salary caps seem to be American sports, and in those American sports there's quite rigid roster sizes of how many players you can have in the squad. Premiership Rugby doesn't seem to have that, so we've got this huge range of players, the number of players within the squad, and that's, to me, seems like a bit of an inefficiency, because if you have a smaller squad, obviously the average you can pay your players goes up massively. So, for instance, the salary cap is 7 million currently. If you have a squad of 50 players in, the average you pay them is £140,000 a year. But if you've got a squad with 40 players in, then that average rises to £175,000 a year. That's a lot more money to play around with. And you can really, really bolster your first 15 by doing that. And it does seem like a lot of these guys who are filling out these big sort of 55-player squads, some of them, are never really going to see the field outside the Premiership Rugby Cup or things like that. They're just kind of there as bin juice on the training paddock. And to me, that seems like a bit of an inefficiency. Even if you are only paying them sort of £40,000-50,000 a year, which isn't loads of money, that's more money you could be using to try and coax a big star to your team that might actually make a tangible difference on the rugby pitch. So the only advantage I can think to having a bigger squad is that it means you might be able to increase your chances of finding uncut gems, essentially. If you have lots of guys, like young guys that you've brought in from the championship and things like that, who you don't know much about, maybe they do just end up holding tackle bags, but there is a chance that one of them turns into a star. But the thing is, it does seem that way too many of these teams just get sort of 29, 30-year-old guys who essentially carry a tackle bag, which don't really provide much value because, maybe they were massively undervalued in other leagues, but, they could drop off a cliff because of their age very, very quickly. You're not going to get much out of them in the long term. So, using that squad to get in, I'm quite a fan of getting rugby league and sevens guys to maybe fill that fringe if you can get them cheap. Or, guys from the championship who might be absolute studs and you don't really know about it. And this is kind of why I wanted to talk about Bristol. I think, the world's quite a negative place at the moment, and I sometimes maybe am a bit negative in the videos and things that I've written, being like, well, look at these dumb clubs. But I think Bristol have been really, really smart. But they're one of the teams that have these accusations of going over the salary cap labelled at them, which I find kind of interesting. The reason for the salary cap existing is to try and introduce fairness into the game. But I imagine the people at the top of Bristol don't think it is that fair. And the reason for this is I've talked about those homegrown player credits. Now, from what I've looked at, Bristol only have 2 guys who qualify for this. And because there's a maximum of £50,000 you can play one player, you need at least 12 players as part of that homegrown credits to be able to fill that £600,000 of your salary cap. So even if they are paying both of these guys £300,000 a year, it doesn't count towards those homegrown player credits. So that's kind of interesting that essentially their salary cap isn't this 7 million that it might be for Saracens and Leicester. It's actually 6.5 million, really. And that puts them at a massive disadvantage. And maybe you can say, well, this is Bristol's own fault because they could have invested more into their academy and things like that. But when you sort of think about it, some of these guys to qualify for homegrown status, being 23, 24, they would have signed for these clubs before their 18th birthday sort of 6-7 years ago, ages ago. And at that point, Bristol were kind of a yo-yo club who weren't really guaranteed any sort of Premiership security. So if you were a young 17-year-old with lots of Premiership offers, why would you go to Bristol if stable clubs like Bath and Gloucester were knocking at your door? It doesn't make any sense. And that's kind of why Bristol's academy does seem to be a little bit weaker, or it has been weaker producing these players recently. Although it does seem to be shifting, and they seem to be signing quite a few guys up to their senior squad for next season. Guys like Will Capon and Ioan Lloyd. I really should know how to pronounce that. My pronunciation is terrible. So that's maybe changing in Bristol's favour positively. And essentially they're getting those guys for free who don't count towards the cap, which is kind of good for them. But this means that Bristol have had to be smart about it. And what they've done is I think they've done a thing called studs and scrubs. And what studs and scrubs is something I kind of learned from fantasy football, like American fantasy football. Because there's 2 ways of drafting a team in American fantasy football. One is the standard snake draft, which is someone gets the first pick and then another team gets the second pick and the third pick. But where this comes from is a thing called auction drafts. And this is where you get given $200 to essentially outbid the other teams for your players. And this is where the studs and scrubs comes from. Because what actually might be more effective is not to try and get an even distribution of players, like getting guys for $15 and $20. What you probably want to do is you want to get 3 or 4 guys who are sort of $40, $50, $60, those absolute superstar guys, and then fill the rest of your team with $1 guys. Because the drop-off from those $50 superstar guys to then the $20, $30 guys is probably bigger than that drop-off from the $20 guys to the $1 guys. And that's sort of what Bristol seem to have done, is try and find those superstars, because the guys earning £500,000, they are incredibly valuable and they're much harder to replace than those guys who are sort of on 200,000. Like the drop-off from the players who are earning $500,000 to those earning 200,000 might be way, way bigger than those earning 200,000 to £50,000. And that's kind of what they've done. And this is why people are saying, well, they must be over the salary cap, signing guys like Kyle Sinclair and Semi Radradra on £500,000 a year probably. But actually, if you sort of think about it, it's not that hard to do. And we can actually just do a bit of basic algebra to show that if you've got 52 players in your squad and you only pay them either £500,000 a year or £50,000 a year, you could actually get 12 guys earning £500,000 a year, which is a lot of superstar firepower. And I mean, that's a great lesson to tell your kids of why they should do algebra, is because eventually they might be able to make YouTube videos that nobody watches. So it does seem that's what Bristol have done, and there's kind of more esportive intelligence things that suggest this is the way the Premiership has gone, is that there is that squeezed middle. There's less of these guys who are on sort of middle tier contracts than there used to be. Now it does seem that people are on higher contracts or lower contracts, and it kind of makes sense from that perspective if you think about the drop-off and the supply and demand between players. Those superstar guys are much, much harder to replace and find their skill set than the guys who are sort of, your sort of 15th, 16th guy in a team. So I kind of sort of hope it works out for Bristol, even though it would be fun for them to be terrible. But I think they'll be better than Bath for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. But I think we should try and applaud and hope that ingenuity and being smart on and off the field goes pretty well for them, because they seem to be doing a great job on and off the field. Like, even just making this video, the interface on their website, so much better than every other team's website when looking at team squad pages. Comparing Bristol's page, where you can just hover over a guy's picture and it tells you their date of birth, compared to Gloucester, which is just white and red. Like, no one seems to have designed it competently. So yeah, Bristol seem to know what they're doing, and I think they have one of the best coaches in the Premiership. As well as having smart people in the back room, by the sounds of it, it could be going quite well for them. Until the Premiership kind of stuck a massive middle finger at them, because they were quite vocally the team most against the salary cap changes. I guess the only thing for Bristol now is, can they keep that up? Because I think it's quite easy to try and recruit these guys on £40,000, £50,000 a year and be like, hey, prove it deal. But once they've been there for 2 years and kind of proved their worth a bit, and they are members of the squad, they're going to be looking for a pay rise. And that's where I think the issue is going to arise if it does. If can Bristol be ruthless in saying, no, we're not going to give you a pay rise because we think we can replace you, which kind of goes against kind of traditional rugby values maybe. And you can't say they haven't earned it, but if you want to win, you kind of have to be ruthless in how you manage the salary cap and be efficient with it. I have sort of touched on the new sort of salary cap changes. Essentially, it does seem the two major changes to me are obviously the senior ceiling going down from 6.4 million to 5 million, which is the big change. But another change that probably isn't going to be touched on a lot is how... So academy players can't be academy players currently, and if they earn over £30,000 a year, but that's gone up to £50,000 a year. So if academy players don't count towards the cap, essentially teams are going to be able to keep players in their academy much, much longer. So again, this probably doesn't favour Bristol and favours other teams with much stronger academies. Excitingly, Super Rugby Aotearoa, I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm really sorry. I genuinely watched YouTube videos on how to pronounce it. That's starting. I've got my Hurricane shirt on, but I might start making little statistical videos about how Super Rugby AO. Apparently, I've seen it written as Super Rugby AO, so I might just say that, not to offend people, because I am bad at languages. I once got asked by a French person when in France to speak English because my French was so appalling. So there we go. And yeah, so I might try and make some statistical videos about that, because when there's only 2 games a week, it's a lot easier to try and find some stats to record and sort of talk about it rather than 6 games or anything. So that would be quite fun to do, and hopefully I do it and don't fall off. And hopefully also there's stats on the internet so I don't have to take everything, because if that's the case, that won't happen. But yeah, finally, just hope you're doing all right. The world's a weird place at the moment. I know I'm a bit mentally all over the place. I'm sure lots of other people are. So yeah, hope you're doing all right. I apologise for the hair. It's getting absolutely out of control. And I did shave the moustache, but the hair's still there. And I'm acutely aware that floppy-haired Englishmen aren't the most popular people in the world at the moment. So please don't throw me in with them.